So thanks for coming, guys. So today we're going to go over pricing. We're going to go over some quick notes about like agreements, so specifically safe agreements and convertible note agreements. Then Pablo's going to wrap up with some productivity principles. Next week, we're going to be discussing everything about pitching, presenting, raising capital, and getting everybody ready for the last session. Um, so I'll just jump right into it. So, and this is something that honestly a lot of founders have a hard time with is these two things specifically: pricing. People don't know what to price it, and then also just understanding like safe notes and convertible note agreements. I think a lot of like first time founders have a really hard time with this. So the biggest thing that pricing does is it helps you grow, right? And there's three different ways that it can do this. The first two are more common. The last one is what you want to go for. So the first one that people always do is they try and either acquire more customers or retain customers, aka keeping them. And the way that they'll usually do this, the lever that they'll use is actually lowering the price. So they're like, "Hey, I need more customers. I don't have enough. Instead of $10, let me go to $5 because people are willing to pay $5." Or, "Hey, some people are leaving the platform. Let me make it free or let me make it $1.99." But where you really want to be is this last bucket. You want to be trying to monetize and charge more per customer. By far, it's going to help your business because at the end of the day, you don't want to be in this game of always trying to reduce prices to keep people who aren't really going to be there to begin with. You want to sell on value, and I'll get into some of these things throughout the presentation. So one small example of how pricing can really kind of drive user behavior and start to also drive growth is the popcorn pricing model. They call it the decoy effect. So I'm sure all of you guys have been to the movie theaters, right? And the way that they do it at the movie theaters is so smart. A small popcorn is $4, and they give you basically a thimble full of popcorn, and nobody wants to pay $4 for one handful of popcorn because you need more. So then you're like, okay, well, what's the next logical size? It's medium, right? And it's 650. But for an extra 50 cents, I could just get a large. So the reason why it's called the decoy effect is this is the decoy, right? You could drive user behavior by literally just putting a simple medium at 50 cents less than the large. So now instead of people coming in and spending $4, 95% of people who come in are just like, you know what? I'm just going to get the large. So this is a small example on how pricing could really affect your business. So there's two different ways that people start to figure out pricing. The one is cost plus and the other one is value-based pricing. So cost plus is basically whatever your cost is. So let's say I'm selling deodorant, right? I know that my deodorant costs me $3. Then I put plus what I want as my margin. So I'm know it's $3. I want 100% margin, so I'm going to charge $6. This is a way that a majority of how everybody does business, but you don't want to be in that business. You don't want to be Dunkin' Donuts. You want to be value-based pricing. And a great example of value-based pricing is Starbucks, right? They're selling you a sip of coffee, a whole cup of ice, milk, and water, right? There's barely any coffee beans in there, and they're charging you 6, 7, $8, and majority of it's just sugar. But the perceived value is what they're really selling. You come in, it's really nice. They have all these crazy flavors. They're launching new stuff every week. So now the perceived value is so much higher. It's illogical because the cup of coffee costs like 2 cents, 5 cents. And you're willing to pay 7.50, $8. So at the end of the day, you want to be in this business. You want to be in the value-based business. This is the game you want to be in. You never want to be in the cheapest tool in the shed, like I say. Like, if not, you'll always be competing on price. You'll always be trying to lower prices. And at the end of the day, you're not going to have like a real business. And it's just going to be too difficult to really grow. Another thing that if you're building a new product, and especially if you're not selling like, deodorant, like I was talking about earlier, people will pay for innovation. So if you're building something cool that nobody else has, people are willing to pay. And they want to pay for the value and they want to pay for the benefits. And honestly, pricing it too cheap almost makes people sometimes think like, is this too good to be true? So most people, I think, really have a hard time with charging people. And so many times you'll see business owners really just kind of price themselves out of a real business. Kevin Hale from Y Combinator talks about this, the 10-5-20 rule, right? So the value that you're bringing should be 10x the price. So let's say that cup of Starbucks coffee, right? The value that you're getting from it is greater than the price, at least in perception. Then what you want to do once you start to sell the product, you want to continuously, and this is how you the 10-5-20 rule is how you figure out what your price is going to be as you continue to grow. So, you launch your app, you're charging $10, per user. Continue to raise your price 5% and 5% increments until you lose 20% of your customer base. Because at the end of the day, and I'll get into this and how it really looks, price optimization. Is that people think that more users and more volume and more customers equates to more money. But this actually couldn't be further from the truth. So let's look at demand and yield as a price optimization. So in somebody take off speaker, who here say somebody out loud either say which one would you do? $5, $10, 15, 20. Who thinks which one is the most profitable? Somebody shout out an answer.
Maybe the $20 one.
The $20 one. See, so usually people will either go for the $5 one because it has 40, or the $20 one because it's such a high number, right? You're like, okay, I'm going to make more money because I'm charging more. Or most people will say $5 because it has the most volume. So this is how many people are converting, and this is how many units you're selling. If you really look at the numbers, the most valuable by far is the $15 one. So, the $5, yeah, you have a lot of customers, but it only really equates to $200 in revenue. But at the end of the day, the $15 price, and this is why you always want to be optimizing price. Because like I said, as soon as you keep increasing this by 5%, you'll start to see, yeah, your numbers go down, but at a certain point, your revenue goes up. Your revenue goes up because you're making more money off less people. And for some products, you can't sell 1 million units anyways. So you want to charge more and have lower volume. And I'll get into that as well. So that goes into the next part is you need to understand how your price affects your sales strategy, right? There's two games that you're going to be in. One is low volume, high ticket, right? So like you're selling one house, right? Real estate agents are a great example of this. Low volume, high ticket. They're selling you $1 million product. Or are you selling pens and pencils? You're going to need to have high volume and it's a low ticket. It's $1. It's $2. And this is really going to affect your strategy and how you're going to go to market. And I'll show you how. So it goes into this $1 billion formula. The $1 billion formula is how you're going to judge. This is how you make $1 billion, right? You want to have 100 million revenue. How you're going to have 100 million revenue is you need to figure out what am I selling it my product for, and how many customers do I need to have. So let's say I'm selling $100 product. That means I need to have 1 million customers. On the exact opposite side, if I have a 100K product, 100K product, I shouldn't have put dollar signs here. I need 1,000 customers. So the way that this is going to affect your strategy is for a consumer product, I can't possibly have, and ignore this dollar sign and this dollar sign. Sorry about that. I can't possibly have salespeople selling 1 million people for $100, right? $100 products. I need to sell 1 million people. So that means that this consumer product right here needs to be high volume, but it needs to be self-service, right? So you can't be in this type of business and you have to literally do outbound sales calls or inbound sales calls and literally walk the person through the sales cycle and sales process. You can here at the enterprise level because I'm selling 100K product, right? So I could hire a sales associate and I could walk them through. Now, the problem is that a lot of people are in this middle ground and they don't understand which one they really need to go towards. At the end of the day, they're selling something super cheap and they're trying to hire sales guys to go over there. And at the end of the day, they're not making any money because the product's not worth enough. So this is the way that whatever you're selling is going to affect your strategy when you're really going to market. And you really want to be in this bucket unless you have high volume and you really understand growth patterns on this one. So improving conversion rates, there's basically two big things that help you do that. One is increasing the knowledge, so kind of closing the knowledge gap on the product. And the number two is decreasing friction, so making it super easy. And this is more for the consumer stuff, so the self-service side. So basically, people are in this gap usually. They it's not like they know nothing, it's not like they know everything. They're starting here and you want to get them here. So you want to start to explain people what your product is, explain the benefits. That's going to help drive sales. But another way, I think my favorite way, because you don't want to be in the business of always having to educate people. This is a hard business to be in. You want to reduce friction. So you want less clicks to buy, right? Like I'm saying, self-service, a big obvious call to action. Sometimes, and there's a really good Y Combinator video on this where they go through web designs and they'll go through the landing page and it's not clear what the call to action is. Is it sign up for the email? Is it purchase here? Is it click here? Is it learn more about the product? And at the end of the day, you want less clicks to buy, right? You don't want to go through 60 clicks where I'm figuring stuff out, I'm leaving information, and then I can make a purchase. You want to minimize that time in between this is what this is, and can I click to buy it? And I think a lot of you guys who have apps are more on the consumer side, so you always want to keep this in mind. Less clicks, call to action, and purchase. Cool. So I'll get into some stuff about agreements, and then I'll switch it over to Pablo. So a safe agreement, it's a simple agreement for future equity. This is going to allow you to receive money without determining the set value of the company. So I'll give you an example, right? So I just launched a company today, right? I have some early traction. I have 100 users. I have 2 developers. I have a product in market. An investor comes to me and he's like, hey, I want to give you $100,000 for your company. How much do I get? Right? Who knows? Who knows what the value of this company is? We don't know what it's valued at. I mean, what are you going to do? Discounted cash flow statements? Or are you going to do multiples on revenue? You just want to get the money and then determine the value of the company at a later date. So the big triggers that you're going to use is a valuation cap. So basically, you're going to have a discussion and say, hey, I don't know what the valuation of the company is, but let's just say the highest it could be is 3 million, right? So give me the 100K and it'll either convert the next time. So there's ways that it converts. It converts when you get equity financing. So that means a priced round. It converts when the company sells, or it converts if they go out of business, which you never want to be in this part. But so this will basically help you raise money at a later determined value. And that's the whole entire incentive for the investors, is that they want a lower valuation cap, because later on when you raise money in that priced equity round, it's going to be, let's say you raise 100K or $1 million at a $10 million valuation. But I set the cap at 3 million. So it converts at the cap that I did because I got in early. So this is investor friendly, but it's also really founder friendly as well. And then the other one that people are going to use is called a convertible note. This is a debt instrument. This is also tricky sometimes because it is debt, and people could actually, it's short-term debt in exchange for equity, but people could actually pay back the capital plus the interest rate, and then honestly you don't get equity. So like the safe 100%, it's more, that's why it's called simple agreement. It's super simple, super straightforward, and it's for sure for future equity. Some people will honestly raise some capital through the convertible note and then just pay back the capital, and then there's no interest, there's no equity that is exchanged. So, but it's similar structure, valuation cap, discount rate, and then there's an interest rate associated with the capital that's lent. That's how the notes convert. Okay, and then last is the post money safe. So you really want to understand the post money safe, because this is going to let you know how much ownership that you're giving up. So post money, it sounds complicated, but it's super easy. It's literally the pre-money valuation plus the money raised. So let's say the company is worth 5 million. I raised $1 million. Now the post-money valuation is $6 million. It's literally just addition, nothing complex. But how you understand how much of the company is sold is doing the math here. I raised $1 million and my post-money valuation was 6 million. So I sold 16.67% of my company in that round. That's why. So I suggest for all of you guys, if you guys are going to raise money, I would just literally look up Y Combinator post money safe. And this is such a simple agreement that anybody can understand the math. It makes it really easy for you to understand how much of your company you're selling, because that's a really big pitfall that early stage founders get into, is they don't realize how much of their company is being sold. And at the end of the day, you want to retain as much ownership as possible going forward, because as you do raise money, you are gonna get diluted out of your position. So starting off strong is really important, because that's where they usually take the most. And then I think that's the last slide. Cool. I'll switch it back to Pablo. Hopefully I didn't go through that too fast, and we're also going to share it with you guys after.
Do you guys have any questions on what he just went over before I start?
I suppose one question that I've always had with that type of structure was, how do you value a company solely based on IP?
Solely based on IP?
Mhm. Like,
So
for
in the
example, sorry.
Yeah, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, like, for example, you have an idea, you patent it, or you have a trademark, you trademark it. And then to get to the next stage, it requires some capital investment. How do you know how much? I'm so sorry about the amount of echo in here.
No, you're good.
How do you value that IP, I guess?
That's a tough one. So that's why the safe agreement and the convertible note agreement are what you're going to use, because honestly, most people that super early stage are going to value the IP in different ways. Some people will be like, okay, well, this is a comparable patent that went to market and the similar market size, and the patent ended up generating XYZ revenue, which would be like comparables. But some people won't want to go through that math. They're like, well, this is different. This is a different patent. This is different. So, I mean, I think that's a tough question. Honestly, I'm not an expert on understanding the like every single patent and how much it's worth, but you have to look at the market size. Um, but yeah, that's a tough one. That's why you'll just use a convertible note or safe.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and we know great lawyers too. If you ever want to ask them questions, I'm by no means a lawyer, so let me also give that disclosure in the recording.
Anybody else? Any other questions? All right, cool. I'll get started. Anybody see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, cool. We're going to talk about productivity and how to maximize your productivity as a startup founder. So before I get started, I do just want to say that context matters, and it's very important to take this with a grain of salt, because everybody's situation is different. You know, all of you guys are in school or taking classes, and you've got other things going on in your life. And so what I'm talking about today is relevant for the time that you're spending on your startup. I'm by no means going to tell you how much time I think you should spend on your startup. That's your decision to make, and it's your choice on how much you want to prioritize your startup. So I'll first start off by saying that it sounds pretty obvious, but oftentimes it's not. The reality is you want to focus early on things that are really moving the needle for your company, and not things that might feel good or feel productive, but not really going to move the needle for your company. And we'll get into some more details about what that means exactly. So one of the biggest pitfalls to avoid, especially for first-time founders, is this shiny object syndrome, where there's so many opportunities and so many different things that you could be doing with your time, and you start getting distracted. You start saying, oh, what if we add this feature? What if we do this? Oh, what if we partner with this organization? And there's all these different things that feels like work, and it feels like you're moving the needle forward. But oftentimes there's just one or two things that are very critical early on, and that's where you need to be spending all of your time. So, it's very common for first-time founders to struggle with this, but the important thing is to recognize when something is a shiny object and when something is truly the priority, or what's really hypercritical at that moment in time. Wanted to share this interesting quote by Warren Buffett, and he said the difference between successful people and really successful people is that really successful people say no to almost everything. And as you'll see, it's very, very important as you're starting a startup to be able to say no. And I'll give you guys an example. So Steve Jobs also had a very similar quote. He said, focusing is about saying no. And many of you have heard the story about, he was kicked out of Apple. A couple years later, they acquired his other company Next, and they brought him back. And when they brought Steve Jobs back, there's actually a really, really good speech that you can actually watch on YouTube of him getting in front of the whole company. And what he says is Apple is going back to its roots. And we're, over the past 2 decades, Apple got very scattered, working on all these different side projects and these different ideas. And, what we need to do is go back to first principles, say no to the things that maybe we can be good at, so that we can say yes to the things that we can be great at. And it is a great speech. And you'll even see like an employee getting up and saying like, oh, so you guys are cutting my whole division, like blah, 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 this stuff. And it's like, it's not an easy choice to make, but you have to be able to say no to these other things that are not hypercritical. The other thing I'll add here is the first time we did Startup Launch Competition, for the demo day, we actually brought up a couple of speakers. And one of them is my friend Joey Levy, who founded Better, the sports micro betting company. And one thing he said when he was talking that really resonated with me and a lot of the people there is that as a startup founder, you're already going against the grain. You have less resources, you have less talent in a lot of cases if you're just starting out just out of college, and you're competing with these large incumbents that have more talented people, more resources. And so your only advantage is your ability to move fast. And the only way you can move fast is by being hyper-focused on a singular value proposition. So you need to figure out what that value proposition is and focus all of your efforts to achieving that. So as a little recap of what we covered last week, we talked about KPIs, and here are the ones that we mentioned. So let me move this out of the way so you can see. So retention, churn, conversion rate, growth rate, revenue, engagement, and active users. These are things that you guys should be actively monitoring and keeping a close eye on. Like, this is something that you should know. You should be getting updates on, once you've launched and you actually have users, you should be seeing updates and like looking at the data at least once a week, potentially even more than that, because this is what's going to really tell you what needs to be done in the company. This is almost like, I believe Justis mentioned the analogy that your KPIs, this is like your symptoms, right? You start to see the symptoms and then you can diagnose, okay, what is the problem? Okay, what do we need to focus on? So if you notice that you have a lot of churn, then okay, there's an issue with the product. People start using it and then they stop using it because it's not sticky enough, or it's not really solving their problem, or maybe that problem is not as common as I thought it was. So pay attention to these KPIs, because this is what's going to tell you what you need to spend your time on. So typically in the early days of a startup, there's only a few things that you should be focusing on, and almost all of them stem from these two things. One is iterating on product, so continuously developing your product. And then the other one is talking to your users and getting feedback. So if you catch yourself doing other things, always try to keep this in the back of your head. This is the priority. And it's very easy to get distracted thinking that, oh, we're making progress, but 99% of things that are unrelated to generating revenue or acquiring active users oftentimes are just a distraction, or not a core focus, or should not be a core priority for your company. Another one, you don't want to be a productivity junkie. So I know this sounds kind of counterintuitive and almost like a silly thing to bring up, but it's very easy to spend time like watching a lot of YouTube videos and like trying to use all these like fancy tools, and like, and I'll elaborate a little bit more here. But what I mean is here's an example. Like there's a lot of tools out there, things like Airtable, Trello, Notion. You can spend a lot of time creating a very organized Notion about this is what I need to do and what I need to focus on. And oftentimes as an early founder, these things can almost be a distraction. You want to always work in the way that your mind operates, right? You don't want to look at other people that are telling you, oh, you need to use this tool. Oh, this tool is great for productivity. But at the end of the day, if it's not like something that resonates with you, and it's not synergistic with your workflow and the way that you work and your personal style of work, then oftentimes it can be a distraction, and it can be annoying because you spend all this time, trying to learn the platform, and there's all this friction, and you're trying to change your own habits. And the reality is you could really just use Apple Notes, or you could use Google Sheets, and like, you don't really need all these fancy tools. And at the end of the day, they can actually be a distraction. And the best analogy that I heard, and this is also from a Y Combinator video, was doing this stuff is almost like cleaning your room because you don't want to actually work on your startup. So just keep in mind like what you're doing with the time that you're spending on your startup, and make sure that you're focusing on the core priorities. There's a really good essay that Paul Graham wrote. He was the founder of Y Combinator, and he talks about the maker schedule. And two things that he mentions is the maker schedule and the manager schedule in this essay. And the key thing here is you need to have self-awareness, and you need to understand what are the core functions that you're focused on as a co-founder, right? If you're the CEO and you're doing the business stuff, okay, you might be on more of a manager schedule, which is you're having a lot of meetings and your day is just packed with meetings, because that's what's going to move the needle forward, right? You're trying to close deals, you're trying to get new investors in, you're trying to find partners. But if you're a builder, if you're an engineer, if you're the one building the product, then you're on a maker schedule. And the important thing to note here is that makers tend to work best when they have large blocks of time that are uninterrupted. And so you want to optimize for that. So you want to try to set time aside where you have not just like 30 minutes or an hour, but maybe like 3 to 4 hours where you can sit down and just get in the zone and build. And I put the link there to the essay. It's very easy to find too. You could also just Google Paul Graham maker schedule. Another thing to be careful about is this thing that actually is quite common for early founders. It's called paralysis by analysis. And it tends to happen when you feel like there's so many things to do that you really don't know where to start. And it makes sense, because as an early startup founder, there really is so many things to do, right? You're trying to build $1 billion company, or you're trying to get to 100 million in revenue, or whatever it is. and it's gonna take a lot of work to get there. But in the early days, you're often doing things that maybe don't make sense later on. And so you have to make sure that you're focused on those key functions early on and to not be paralyzed. So oftentimes less is more. When you find yourself in a position where you feel like overwhelmed because there's so much to do, just try to write down what are the 3 most important things that I should be focused on, and just start with the hardest one. And that way you can at least start moving forward. So another thing here is oftentimes when you're having meetings, if you schedule an hour for a meeting, you may be tempted to take a whole hour for that meeting. But does that mean you need an hour for that meeting? Probably not. A lot of meetings don't require more than 30 minutes, and some meetings you don't really even need more than 15 minutes. Now, I understand if you're trying to build a relationship with somebody and they can really add a lot of value to your company, then you want to get some in-person time. And there's no substitute for actually spending that time. So, there's obviously exceptions here, but most meetings, when you really think about it, if you just condense them and put them as half the time, you'll still be able to get through the main objective of that meeting in that shorter time frame. Oh yeah, the other thing I'll mention here is most meetings you don't really need to have in-person meetings unless you're trying to build that relationship or something that's really critical. So another tactic to continuously improve how productive you are and how fast you're moving is to audit yourself and constantly be just reviewing, okay, what did I get done in the past week? And what did I spend the majority of my time doing? If you use Google Calendar, you can just look back and see all the things that were on your calendar that you were doing. If you don't use it as frequently, then you can just think about, okay, for all the hours that I was working on my startup, what was I actually doing? And how many of those things actually fall into the core functions of what I need to do to actually build my startup? And then we'll get into some case studies, but before we get into that, I want to start with, I want to just mention that this is something that we see a lot of early founders talk about, and that I think is a huge mistake, is that they think they need to delegate a lot early on. The reality is, in the beginning, the founders are doing everything, and you should be doing everything. You should not be trying to delegate, especially the core functions that we just talked about, right? Just talking to users and building product. There's not really anything you can delegate there. Those are core functions of the company, and the founders need to be taking those functions on. So don't get distracted trying to hire interns or find other people that you can pass work to. The reality is it's distracting. It's going to take up more of your time because now you have to manage somebody, and that's less time that you have to actually work on your startup. Oh yeah, I guess one more thing, and then we'll get into case studies. So a good way, almost like a recap of everything, a good way to think about this and a good mindset to have is you want to start by thinking about, okay, what am I trying to get to? What is the end goal for this company? And then work backwards. What is it going to take to get there? And you keep working backwards. Okay, in order to build a unicorn that solves X problem, well, I'm going to have to create a lot of value for these types of people and scale this company to 100 million. And you work back. Okay, to get to 100 million in revenue, I'll have to raise my first round of funding, right? And I'll have to get my first 1,000 users or whatever it is, right? And then you keep working backwards, and then you start to get to the core functions that you really need to do to get to that next step. And then just focus on that next step. You don't want to be thinking every single day about the destination. That will distract you and it'll overwhelm you, and it's not a good use of your time. You want to be hyper-focused on those core functions that are going to help move the needle. So the case studies we're talking about today are just ones that the companies were incredibly, when you think about it, so ambitious that most people would have thought you were crazy and there's no way you're going to pull this off. But they somehow did, as early founders with very limited resources. And so we'll start with the first one, Cruise. And Cruise has actually been in the news quite a bit recently, and they're going through some difficult times because of the government in California. Cruise is, for those who don't know, they're they're basically like a self-driving car company. So, and they're starting with like robo-taxis. So if you go to San Francisco, you will actually see the robo-taxis around the streets. Now, I don't know if that's still true today, but I know like a few months ago it was true, because there's been some new policies that have been passed due to some issues that they were having. But in the early days, think about it. Let's say that you're an early founder and you say, I want to build a self-driving car company. Like, how do you even start there, right? It's such a big mountain to climb. So what these founders did, they realized, obviously, we're going to need to raise a lot of capital. We need to have a very strong technical team to be able to pull this off. And we're going to need like a lot of capital to be able to pay them. So what the early founders did is they said, how can we demonstrate to early investors that we're going to be capable of pulling this off? Because usually your first round of funding, people are taking a bet on you. It's not so much the product or even the traction per se. It's mostly the team. So what they decided to do was create a car that you could actually like, they linked an Xbox controller to it, and you could drive the car using an Xbox remote. Because this is just like, I mean, who thinks about this? Like, how hard could this be to do? I mean, it must be insanely difficult to take a regular like car and fix a Xbox remote to it. And then what they did is, when they were meeting with investors, they would actually bring investors to like a parking lot, like a parking garage, and then just let them experience it themselves and be like, look at this is what we're trying to build. This is what we've done so far. This is why we're going to be capable of actually achieving this, right? So it doesn't matter how hard what you're trying to do is, or how many obstacles there's going to be. There's always something that you can do early on, that some type of MVP or some type of proof point. Another one that seems even more difficult than this is a company called these are what the Cruise cars look like, by the way. So they have like these 360 cameras on their roof, all these sensors, and they were all over San Francisco last time we were there. So Boom. Who's heard of a company called Boom? Anybody? Okay, maybe one person. So yeah, Boom Supersonic. They were basically, they're like, we're going to build supersonic jets. Now think about how ambitious that is for an early startup, no resources. I mean, they were engineers and they had experience in industry, but like, this is a big challenge to take on, especially if you don't have $1 billion to get started, right? So the founders did everything that they could. They were part of Y Combinator, and they were getting close to demo day, and they realized, hey, if we pitch at demo day and we have nothing to show, then we're screwed. We need to get something, even if it's not a prototype or a product. Like, we need to have some type of proof point that we're going to be able to pull this off. And the founders actually heard that Richard Branson was coming to LA for a new space shuttle that they had created, that they were having a launch for. And so without being invited, they literally just showed up. This is an actual quote from the founder of Boom Supersonic. They just crashed the rollout, basically, the space shuttle launch. And they went up to Richard Branson and they told him about it. And then they were able to get a meeting with him. And in that meeting, Richard Branson basically said, hey, I'll sign an LOI to purchase the first 10 from you. So all of a sudden, and that's a $5 billion order, by the way. Obviously, it's going to take them years to get to a point where they could actually sell this and actually have the transaction. But the fact that they were able to get this type of LOI from like such a legitimate brand, Virgin Galactic, it was a very strong proof point that they'd be able to pull this off. Or in this case, I don't know if it was Virgin Galactic. It might have been actually just Virgin Airlines, actually. And then the last one I'll say is Uber, because I know a lot of you guys are actually building marketplaces. And this is why I wanted to include this one, because marketplaces are extremely difficult for their own set of reasons, which is different than what we just went over, which was like hardware, like really capital intensive hardware. So the way Uber started was actually as a black car service. So it was like high-end taxis. And it was for people that could afford to pay a lot more money and were willing to pay more for a better experience, right? And then they created an app. But the key thing about when Uber first started is they didn't say, hey, we're going to have all these different product offerings. We're going to have different budget, lower budget taxis and then high end. And the other thing is they didn't say we're going to launch in 10 different geographies at once. They said we're starting just in San Francisco, and then we'll scale from there, right? And they actually spent, I believe it was a few years, just operating in San Francisco before they got to a point where they were able to raise some capital and actually expand to other geographies. And the reason for doing this is because of the marketplace challenges that people face, right? The chicken and the egg problem, or the cold start problem, whatever you want to call it. But in order for them to succeed, they need to have a good amount of drivers and a good amount of riders. And it's very hard to do this if you're launching over the entire country at once. And so every launch into a new geography for them was like a big deal. And they would treat it as such. And they would have press releases, and they would have launch parties, and they would make sure that they had a lot of key influential people in those different geographies involved, so that they could create and generate enough buzz to be able to get past that initial cold start problem. So if you're starting a marketplace, it's really important to start very simple. Start with just one core product offering. Start with just one geography, if possible. Just narrow it down and then just hyper focus on that, and focus on trying to get some traction with those users. And that's the end of it. So I'll stop here, and happy to answer any questions, and then we'll wrap up in the next 5 to 10 minutes.
I think while you were talking, there were some parts that made a lot of sense, and there were some parts that I was kind of confused on. One part of it was you were saying that if you're CEO, a lot of your time might be meetings, but at the same time you wear all of the hats, and so I guess balancing between a product that is still in development versus influential moments or a key milestone seems a little bit tricky, insofar as, at least for my product and service, we kind of have multiple potential endpoints, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Could you maybe share a little bit more context into your product?
Okay, so the product that we were developing is an N95.
Yep.
So we're looking at potentially two endpoints. One of them is licensing the IP, and one of them is manufacturing and selling, one of that which is substantially easier than the other. Now, typically for the licensing portion of it, what would happen would be is a company like 3M or Johnson & Johnson, Ansell, one of them, would want to license or purchase the IP outright if you get to the first sale. But the first sale requires all of the manufacturing backbone, if that makes sense.
Right.
And so it's very hard for me to separate the two, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in a way, you answered the question there. In order for you to get to the IP part, you need to demonstrate that you're able to sell, right? And so there's two core functions that come to my mind. One is developing masks, which I assume you've already created a design and you have somebody manufacturing them for you and shipping them over. So maybe that piece is not as time intensive, but I could be wrong there. And then the other piece is actually closing the sales. So talking to hospitals, talking to maybe retailers or whoever's going to actually be able to distribute these masks for you. Those seem to be the two core functions that I can identify. And when I was going back to like the CEO and like CTO thing, if you're the CEO, you're not typically the one building the product or dealing with the manufacturing of the product. You're the one who's going to be out there having meetings that have to do with distribution, that have to do with channel partners, that have to do with raising capital or anything that's going to help drive revenue and grow the company. And if you're the engineer, if you're the CTO, then most of your role entails actually focusing on building the product or iterating on feedback that you're getting on the product. And then the CEO should be conducting a lot of the interviews as well. So, and then channeling some of that feedback over to the CTO. But it is okay to have some overlap in the early days too. Like it's especially like day one startups, like it's very common to have a CEO who's also partially technical and maybe is also working on product. And then it's very common to have both that are talking to users. So there's nothing wrong with that. Again, like context really matters here, and it's very important to identify, what does your team dynamic look like? What does your core strengths look like? And what is it exactly that you're doing? And then kind of take bits and pieces from the lecture.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I have one.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So part of what you're saying makes us think we're doing things right, and then part of what you're saying makes us think we're doing things like really wrong. So right now we're trying to like develop our MVP and go out and test user and like get our proof of concept, but we're also trying to enter as many of like pitch competitions, funding opportunities as possible. Are we doing like is that something we should be focused on simultaneously, or should we just put most of our efforts into solely the proof of concept first?
It's a good question. So I think context matters, and it's very important to focus on where you're at. But the reality is, if you're really trying to build a startup, pitch competitions can be a waste of time. Like unless you're getting a big check from that, or if you're getting exposed to a certain audience that's going to help you really move the needle for your company, then it can really be a distraction. And it can really be a waste of time because you spend a lot of time preparing for these things, right? And submitting materials and all these things. So again, a lot of you guys are just getting started and this is your first startup. So pitch competitions can be a way to just continue to learn and get better at pitching. So I think, take bits and pieces from this, but don't feel like you need to follow everything to a T because everybody's situation is going to be different.
No more questions?
Well, I was wondering if I could ask a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
How much of your competitors' research could you use to leverage your own company? And I say that insofar as one of, I guess, the interesting portions of at least my business is that Amazon was claiming to have invented my solid mask in 2020, but my IP actually predates theirs by 2 years. So I have the patent actually for 2018.
So in general, it's important to be aware of your competitors because it's going to allow you to understand where you fit in the market and maybe what you can do better. But spending too much time focusing on your competitors is also like a big distraction. If you just focus on your competitors all the time, you're never going to be better than them. You're just going to be trying to catch up and keep up with them. So that's one. But now you asked a very specific question, and for that one, I don't know that I have a great answer. I think that there's just too many factors here. I don't know what the IP looks like, and there's a lot of stuff that I don't know about the exact situation. So it's hard for me to give you like specific advice for that situation.
Yeah, I agree with Pablo. What's the Sarah Blakely from Spanx, right? Is that what it's called, Spanx? She was on Shark Tank, and she was just saying like all these two girls, they went on there and pitched, and a majority of the money that they had, they were actually trying to sue a competitor who was infringing on the patent. And she said that's actually the reason why I'm not going to invest in you guys. She said because when I launched Spanx, everybody could just do the same exact thing, and they were infringing on what she had patented. But instead, what she did was she went out and sold more and beat them through sales. And realistically, it's like going to be impossible to sue somebody like Amazon. So I wouldn't even really worry too much on the patent stuff and the other companies' research. I would just get out there and try and get as much traction as you can as quickly as possible.
Thank you.
I have one quick question. Should we be kind of prepared for like next week to do like a practice pitch, like with slides, without, like or anything at all? Like what should we be prepared for?
Yeah, I would say everybody should come prepared with something that they are ready to pitch, whether it's like slides or like having at least like a pitch that they've practiced, because we are going to go over pitching and we're going to give a lot of tips for delivering a great pitch, but also we want to give time for everybody to practice. So next week might be one of the longer sessions because we are going to give people the opportunity to pitch and then be able to give them feedback as well.
Okay, thank you.
How long would the pitches be?
3 minutes.
And is next week the final week?
The final week before the 5th, which is the competition.
Okay, bummer.
Sorry,
miss
I'm
you guys.
lagging.
Yeah. By the way, I found a nice I found a nice room here to hang out in during the Zoom.
Nice.
Love that room. All right, cool guys. That's about it. Yeah, I would definitely suggest coming with the deck ready to pitch next week. If any of you guys have any questions, we are gonna set some office hours, and then also just like feel free to reach out to us. Like you guys have, I think, our number, LinkedIn, everything. So just feel free to reach out. You're not bothering us. Always here to help.
Awesome. Happy Thanksgiving,
All right.
everybody.
Happy Thanksgiving, guys. See ya.
See you guys.